The next book that we're going to look at is called James. One of the big controversies that we have in the book of James is whether or not it's even a letter at all. Is it a letter or is it a book? What is James? And in some ways, what you need to think of, or maybe the best way you can think of James, is to think of it as a sermon, or at least a collection of sermons. What happens with James is that it begins in certainly chapter 1, setting out what he's going to be really dealing with in the rest of his book. Now, we need to say very clearly, though, about James, is that James was not seen highly by many people. In fact, from the time of the early church all the way through into the Reformation. In fact, Martin Luther called it the Epistle of Straw. The Epistle of Straw. What he really meant was that there was nothing in it about resurrection. There was nothing in it about the saving power of Jesus. There was nothing in it that talked about grace rather than works. And in fact, Luther was very worried that what would happen is that they would go back to a works-based theology, which was the very thing that he was against during the Reformation. You need to remember that the reason why Martin Luther got so excited about the issues that were happening in his time in the 16th century was because people began to believe that they could buy their way by good works into heaven. Effectively, it was just by making sure they didn't do anything really bad, they could then work out a way to get out of this place called purgatory, this waiting room for heaven. And by working for it, by actually doing something, even here on earth, and in fact by your relatives paying money to the church, you could be prayed out of purgatory and into heaven. That concept of a works-based salvation was the very thing that Martin Luther was against. And of course, when he read the book of James, immediately he was struck by the fact that James seems to be all about works. And so because of that, he was worried that in the end it would knock back people back into this concept that I can earn my way and my salvation. So no grace, but rather works. And so he came against James. And in fact, when he was writing his German translation of the New Testament, he was sorely tempted to leave James out of the canon. Yet when we look at James all the way through history, we realize that James was always seen to be part of the process of the canon. And so even in the early church they had some questions whether or not to keep James in the canon, there seemed to be no question that it was part of that early church. It was part of those who had connected with Jesus. And it's that we connect with. And we think that the book of James, and of course James again is not it's not a Hebrew name or Greek name. It's rather the Latin version of the name. The Greek version of the name is in fact Jacob. And so Jacob is the name that would have been for James. James would have been known as Jacob. And this is most probably, again, we say, well, who was this James? Is he James, the brother of John? Is he James, the elder? We don't know who he is. But we suspect that this James is another earthly brother of Jesus. Just like Jude, we have James. He's mentioned, for example, when his mother and his brothers come to collect him because they think that maybe he's gone off the road a little bit. So they come and collect him to take him back home. And so that's where the connection comes with this particular Jacob. We think that this Jacob becomes the head of the church in Jerusalem. And so writes from that perspective. He's writing, therefore, a very Jewish perspective, a very Jewish way of connecting with it. And so when you read the book of James, you need to read it with those Jewish mindset, that Jewish conception of understanding about this. Because if you don't do that, then sometimes you again miss some of the tradition that he's writing in. Because the tradition he's writing in is what you could call the wisdom tradition. Very much like Solomon's Proverbs. So the book of Proverbs is a group of these pithy sayings, these one-liners, which trying to give you a point. But as we've said before about Proverbs, is that when you take them just at superficial value, when you take them just at their obvious value, we miss the concepts within them. What we need to do is to delve underneath them and say, well, what was inspiring that proverb? What was inspiring that way of thinking? Now, the way in which James does that is by using an alternation between teaching, and then out of the teaching comes an encouragement to do something. So you've got the teaching, which is usually connected to a piece of scripture, most often a piece of Tanakh. And what happens is that you go from there, it's almost like the sermon system, where you've got a reading, you've got a teaching on the reading, and then you have an encouragement, you have an exhortation, something for you to go and do. And the exhortation is the part that's the focus, not so much the teaching. Is that what James wants us to do is to say, now that you've heard the teaching, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to go and connect with it? And so if you look at chapter 1 of James, you see that it lists, effectively as you go through it, you can see all the things that he's going to deal with in his book. Most probably what you can think of there is that most probably what he did was he was looking at the issues that he saw affecting his congregation. It might even have been a number of sermons that he had preached over a period of time, which were then collected together and put into this one volume. So when was it written? Well, we don't know. But it was written somewhere, most probably, between 60 and 80. Most scholars would feel that it was written later rather than earlier. It was later, so that already some of the things that had happened to the Jews would have already been there. What happened to the Christians would have already been there. And so he's writing into that context. Very much, though, a later part of Christianity as well, because what was happening in Christianity later on was that maybe because Jesus hadn't come as soon as they thought he was going to, that people began to get lax. People began to get lax in their discipleship. People began to get lax in their sense of what to do. And so Peter, or at least James, responds by saying, stop that. Stop getting lax and actually live again the way in which you were meant to live within Jesus. I think the other thing with James that we have the big discussion about is that is then there a dispute between Romans and James? Is there a dispute between Paul and James? Is it about grace versus works? I don't think so. I think that James takes for granted, just like in some ways Romans 13 does, that we already love God, that we're already connected into God. But the reality is that it's no use just being connected to God. It's no use dealing with cheap grace, a grace where, yes, I'm saved, so now I can do whatever I feel like doing. What James wants to emphasize is that, yes, we are saved, but we are saved in order to do the good works. And I think if we read Paul properly, that's really what Paul's talking about as well.